Welcome to Face2Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face2Face. So my next TIFF interview was with the filmmaker Brian O'Malley. We talked about his new film, a psychological horror called The Lodgers. And I mean, this is a movie that completely took me by surprise. I am not somebody who is steeped in the horror tradition. I've seen a few films along these lines over the years, and I was deeply engaged. This is a beautiful film. This is a complicated film. It's a story that unfolds in front of us, but in a deeply psychological way and bordering on the horrific. But what's really interesting about it, some profound insights about who we are and about choice and about responsibilities. I love the fact that they filmed this in a haunted house in Ireland that was in its 666th year. And apparently none of the cast and or crew would stay at the house. Brian talks about how melancholy has made him feel over the years. We talk about water and its importance in the film, and guilt and love, and how the house as a metaphor was in a state of dereliction. It's a interesting and engaging piece, and as again I said, just gorgeous to look at. So coming right up, Brian O'Malley and the Lodgers. Don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about my speaking and writing, face2facelive.ca for all of my interviews, and rabble.ca as well for more information there about the news for the rest of us. Coming right up, Brian O'Malley and the Lodgers. Well, welcome to Face2Face. We're joined by another very special guest today. Director Brian O'Malley here is today to talk to us about his new film, The Lodgers, which is going to be showing in about 10 days, very soon at the Toronto International Film Festival. Brian, thanks for your time today. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, David. I'm really delighted to talk about the film, finally, to be able to discuss it.
Oh, that's awesome. So are you calling from Dublin? Are you in Ireland currently? Or?
Yeah, I'm in Dublin, Ireland right now. It's about 7 o'clock in the evening. I think it's about, is it 11 a.m. your time-ish?
It is actually, it's about 1:52. So I think we're about 6 hours
behind
you guys, something like that. Yeah. You're far more progressive than we are. You've got 6 hours on us, Brian.
Yeah, exactly. Time traveling.
So why horror? Is that a fair question right out of the gate? Why a horror film for you?
Yeah, I think it is a fair question. I mean, if you take a step back to my first film, that is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, horror. I think it's psychological, thrillerish, supernatural thrillerish horror, but it's still horror. I found myself in 2013, and we shot it in 2015 or 14. Sorry, it came out in 2015 with an opportunity to make a movie, and it was a horror. And I'm a massive fan of genre movies, including horror. I mean, the first horror I ever saw was Halloween by John Carpenter, which I saw when I was about 13, and it kind of blew my mind. But I'd actually been a little bit spoiled, I think, because that was kind of, I think, not necessarily the first, but it was one of the first elevated horrors of the time that came to prominence. I found very much as I grew older, I always kind of wished people would go back to that type of a horror movie. But my interest as a director expanded way beyond horror into science fiction and thrillers, etc. And so, I was always very open-minded about what I might make. But when Let Us Pray came my way, it was a horror, and I fully embraced it. So that's kind of how that started.
Is it the story? Is it the goth side of it? Is it the? And I know there's a few allusions to Edgar Allan Poe in the film, but are you a huge fan of the Raven, for instance, the poem? There's a great line in the film, by the way. I think it's one of the characters who says, "Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of time for poetry," which clearly I think the Irish do, from what I know.
Yeah, no, they absolutely do. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a reference to that character is what he's just been through in the last number of years.
Yes.
Poetry has been the last thing on his mind. But David Turpin, who wrote the film, is a doctor of Gothic English literature, so he's absolutely steeped in the history of Gothic literature and the poetry, etc. So it is a as a script, it was a film that was kind of dripping with that. But personally, as a director, I'm a massive fan of Gothic cinema, if you like. And if strangely, I would say that all started with an obsession with Depeche Mode in the mid to late 1980s. I've always,
That interesting.
yeah, I've always been drawn to that. Even though I'm a very positive person, and I always see the positive side of things musically and in terms of films. I've always been drawn to very dark subjects. Um, so the Gothic aesthetic in terms of visuals and music has always appealed to me hugely, and I would credit Depeche Mode with that.
That's hilarious. So
Yeah.
I've read a little bit of a background on the film. I've read a couple of interviews with some of the actors in the film, and they refer to you, as just being a wonderful guy to work with, such a good guy, a lovely guy, I think was the direct quote. Why, how, and why are you so drawn to the dark and the melancholic? Would you say is it purely a stylish thing, or is there something else going on there, Brian?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I really always liked when I was young and when I was found an interest in film. I really liked how melancholy made me feel because uh,
Hmm.
I when you're a teenager and you're struggling with your emotions and the various things you're going through. I always found more melancholic music and cinema kind of eased my soul, if you like. And then you get older and you get a grip on yourself. But I've always been drawn, yeah, I've always been drawn to that sort of cinema and music. I find it very comforting to watch and to listen to. Uh,
So I mean, I would imagine most people go to see horror films. And I got to be really honest with you. I have not seen that many horror films over the years, and I don't know if this is what horror is all about. Count me in. By the way, congratulations on a beautiful film. I mean, it's gorgeous to look at, and the performances are stunning, so clever, and really, really interesting on so many levels. I mean, it appealed to me on relational levels. There's politics going on here. There's sexuality. There's questions about sexuality. It's fascinating film. So thank you.
Pleasure. I mean, it was a pleasure for me to direct, and certainly you can imagine when I was reading the script for the first time, like there's a part in the script where Rachel is accosted, if you like, by Sean in the forest, and uh, she says, "You wouldn't follow me all the way home, limping like that, would you?" And he said, I would if you asked me to." And when I read that exchange, I just thought, okay, this writer really knows how to play with nuance. And I would say that was the moment in the script when I went, I think there's something very special going on here.
Well, it's to Brian. Is it fair to say that this? I mean, this is modern existentialism in the making, coming out on screen. This is about a woman who's looking for freedom, who is not going to who says, forget the fate, forget the determinism. I want to step out and decide and choose and be free and responsible. And that's kind of one of the sort of the subtext I certainly saw.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely there, and I think that's really beautiful on two levels. It's beautiful because what you've got is a period story with a woman someone who represents a modern, the future of a modern Irish woman, and I think that's certainly why I was drawn to it, because I really liked the idea of her being this very modern character in this period film. But also, she very much represents what Ireland was about to become, because it was 1920. So that's 4 years after we had the Rising against the British, and 2 years before we gained independence, and which led to us becoming a republic. So you have a country that's in transition, that's on the verge of being free of its ancestral shackles and discovering what it might be, and a central character who's in exactly the same position. And I thought that was a beautiful and it was an absolutely intentional part of the character. And whilst that's not something that's necessarily going to travel, because we still live in a world almost 100 years later where people think Ireland is in the UK, but certainly for me, I thought that was a beautiful parallel between the character and the country.
It's really interesting, just this sort of, it's not, I was going to say coming of age. It's not that. I mean, it's something we all do throughout the age, it seems to me, throughout our lives. We're always coming to terms with with our freedom. I mean, isn't that what the French existentialist said? It scares the heck out of us. We don't know what to do with it. And isn't, I mean, on some level, isn't that, I suppose, what horror is really all about, with the psychological aspect, the fear of the unknown. I mean, Edward at one point says, I think, if you've seen the world I have, you'd know you're safer here. You'd know you're safer in the house. Don't dare go outside.
Yeah, that's Sean, of course, yeah. And of course, she can't imagine there's anything in the outside world that could be as horrifying as what she is expected to endure. So that's fascinating. And then, of course, Edward, the brother, he then represents the other side of it, where he doesn't have the strength or the bravery to take that step outside. And
he's the antithesis of that, wanting to become a truly human, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and he's destined to remain in the past.
So I understand you actually shot the film in a haunted house. Is this true?
Apparently, yes, we did. We shot it. Apparently it's haunted. Yeah, we shot it in a house called Loftus Hall, which is in a part of Ireland in Wexford. It's called Hook Head. You've probably heard of the term by hook or by crook.
Of course.
Yeah, well, that refers to Hook Head in Wexford, which is interesting. So this house is perched actually on a fairly barren piece of land. We had to create the shrubbery and the trees outside, but it's actually on basically a wide open space near the edge of a cliff beside the sea. But the house turned 666 years old and was last year. Yeah, I know, believe it or not. And but the house, as we see it in the film, which represents an extensive rebuild that occurred about 250, 300 years ago. So when and we shot it entirely on location. There are no sets in the film. So when you stepped in, when I stepped inside that house, it was like traveling back in time when you cross that threshold, which you see one of the characters do in the film. But when you do it for real, you really do feel like you've stepped back through time, and you're in this time capsule, because everything in the house, the walls, the doors, the floors, the staircase, are hundreds of years old, and that's a kind of a really remarkable thing to experience on a daily basis for the few weeks we were in the house.
I bet. Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher, father sort of utilitarianism, I'm pretty sure it was him who said something to the effect of, the reason we believe in ghosts is because we've never actually really seen one. And I think it's a really interesting notion. It's scientific, it's empirical. Did you guys have any sightings in the house while you were there? Anything that led you to believe that maybe you'd stepped, you'd gone in a little too deep?
I didn't personally. It's funny. On one hand, I think, do you have to be open to these things for them to happen? But maybe that's the very time it's going to happen, And I'd be lying if I was to say to you that I'd happily stay in that house on my own overnight, because I don't think I would. However, someone did. One of the members of our crew, who was actually the caretaker of the house, but he became a member of the crew while we were shooting. He stayed on several occasions in the bed that's in the film, the big red Gothic bed.
Wow. Okay.
He stayed in it, and he said the first night he stayed in it, he lay down on the bed to go sleep, and after a couple of minutes, because it's a 3-story building and the bedroom was in the middle floor, he said that above him, in the room above, he heard footsteps circling around the room above him, and that's pretty creepy. And he's not a guy who's prone to that sort of thing. He's very open-minded about it. He says, I don't believe in this, but this is what happened last night.
Yeah, so just so you know, the creep factor goes up when a director of horror films finds something like that creepy. That just changes the conversation, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Tell me
Quite
about.
strange.
I mean, it's a stunning film. The colors, the outside colors are so beautiful and gorgeous. The greens, the life. Can you tell me a little bit about the contrast, the cinematography? Was that really deeply intentional from a storytelling perspective? You know, the light, the darkness, that simple sort of imagery of good and evil. And then I want to ask you about Irish Catholic guilt.
Yeah, okay. Well, so yeah, certainly visually it was. We wanted the interior to have a kind of an oppressive, dark atmosphere to it, limited in colour. And then outside, once she left the grounds of the estate, we wanted that to be more inviting to represent somewhere she might want to be.
Right.
So that was entirely intentional. What we did was we shot the film with old Japanese anamorphic lenses, which and I did something similar on Let Us Pray, although I used Russian ones on that, but this time they were Japanese, and they brought a texture to things that made everything feel instantly instantly, I suppose, gave them a slightly older feel. So you immediately felt like what you were looking at had some history to it. It didn't feel brand new and crisp, which can be a problem with modern high definition digital cameras that we use. So I use those lenses that to help place the film, to give it a little bit more of texture, that it felt a little bit more grounded in the past. But in terms of the lighting, etc., I mean, I studied sculpture and I went to art college. So before I make a movie, I storyboard it entirely, start to finish. So I had a very clear idea of cinematically how I wanted the film to play out. But obviously that all changes, and once a cinematographer comes on board, and once the actors come on board, and you're on the set and you're blocking it out, things change hugely. But between myself and the cinematographer, we went to great lengths to make sure that every scene was as beautiful as we could make it, and was shot in as interesting a visual manner as it could be. Because when you're shooting inside the same space for 2 weeks and you're going to reuse scenes, locations over and over again, it's really important to try and not repeat yourself, which I learned in Let Us Pray. That you have to always find a way to approach that space slightly differently. So if you can find an interesting visual aesthetic, that then allows you within a space to explore it in a more visually engaging manner. But the first shot of the entire film was that beautiful wide shot in the dining room when Rachel walks up to the window and opens the curtains. And I can recall when the curtains were pulled apart and that beautiful shaft of light came in, that huge sense of relief that the film I had in my head was everybody. I could tell in that moment that everybody around me was in exactly the same space. The DP, the production designer, the cast, and I knew when I saw that shot on screen and we did a take, that we were in for certainly a very beautiful looking film, and I think it is a very, very fine looking piece of cinema.
Yeah, it's absolutely stunning. It's gorgeous to look at. I think I mentioned that already, but the contrast is just so crisp, I think is a good way to put it. So Brian, tell me if you can, if you dare, talk to me a little bit about Irish or just Catholic guilt in general. How about just guilt? Forget about Irish, forget about Catholic. How about just guilt?
Yeah, it's funny, it's something that I kind of, around the age of 15, I realized it wasn't going to play any part in my life. So it's not something I'd like to think I don't suffer from it, but it's one of those things that I'm not sure you can analyze yourself enough to know whether you really do or not. But it certainly is it is a thing. It does exist. I've met many people who suffer from it. And I suppose it's that the church's ability to make you think that, in some way, shape, or form, anything you do that steps outside what they consider to be, moral boundaries will somehow come back, and you'll pay a price for it. And that's a very valuable tool in controlling an entire nation, which is what the Catholic Church managed to do. It's funny because we were talking about the history lesson earlier on. I feel quite strongly that the Irish basically exchanged one oppressor from another. So we went from being oppressed by the British to being oppressed by the Catholic Church, and we kind of thought we were free, but we weren't. And in many ways, I think Ireland is only now, in the last 15 years, 20 years, entering a stage of enlightenment. where more and more people no longer consider the Catholic Church to be uh, some a group of people they should look to for any sort of moral guidance. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah, I think for me, what really comes out in the film is this, and I think oppression is a great word, and I think we all kind of suffer from it. Call it guilt, call it shame. One of my most recent interviews was with a guy by the name of Peter Gaidich, who went through conversion therapy for
Right.
6 years, coming out of a Catholic environment, and they were, claiming he had to get back to his innate heterosexuality, and so he checks himself in for 6 years. The book is called The Inheritance of Shame, and you wonder to what degree that kind of shame, that kind of guilt, that kind of imposition, what does it do to the psyche? What does it do to the soul? What does it do to our ability to relate to others and to include and embrace? And honestly, I actually think you're dealing with that in this film. I mean, I don't know if you would agree or if you see it or if, David, the screenwriter, would want to talk more about it. And maybe that's a subtext in goth horror itself. But I really see that, the stain of their children's children, I think was the phrase. It's as if the water that by the way, water, I don't think I've ever seen water used in such kind of a negative way. and it's really interesting. You really turn that on its head, and this kind of washing away of the sins seems to be a theme throughout the film.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Your take on that, and I'm a firm believer that films often have themes in them that aren't necessarily apparent to the filmmakers, but are legitimate nonetheless. Because
absolutely,
I certainly know myself and David were consciously wanted the film to be devoid of religion. We felt that the family would have abandoned it once they kind of decided to embrace the lifestyle several hundred years ago that they were going to continue with, that they would have also abandoned religion. So we felt that certainly the twins would have had absolutely no sort of religious background or teaching. But I certainly can see how the water, there's certainly a rebirth in it throughout the film.
Yeah, well, ultimately it is redemptive, and this is what's so fascinating to me. You don't feel like you're ever going to get to redemption when you're, it seems to me, in such a dark, oppressive environment like this. And yet, ultimately, because of some choices, because of Rachel taking some responsibility, she like as you said, she's reborn.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting that the rebirth is through water, which I suppose it's certainly a very Christian view of rebirth, so you're probably not wrong. There probably are some religious themes in there that I wouldn't necessarily have been tuned into, but I suspect if you spoke to David, he may reveal that they were entirely intentional. But I do know between I do know between the two of us are the intent. We had discussed the film of being void of religion in terms of any of the cast in it or its influence. But if you look at the villagers in the film, in reality they would have very much been influenced by the church around them. But we chose not to make that part of the story or to have any religious characters in it for a number of reasons. Partly because we're Irish and we've grown up watching movies with that, and we're kind of tired of it. Certainly because we just wanted the film to exist within its own sort of space, and we didn't want that intrusion of that typical Catholic Ireland to impose itself upon the film.
Yeah, well, I think what we're talking about is any kind of work of art, it seems to me, has a whole other level of intentionality. I mean, authorial intention, or the implicit idea, the indwelling, that you as the filmmaker, and then you bring in the editor, and the score is brilliant, by the way, and you bring all these different people into play, and they bring their own worldviews and assumptions, and how does that actually tease out in a film? I mean, I don't really truly know. Deeply relational and a part of a fascinating creative community, but it's quite remarkable how anyone can make a film, actually.
Yeah, sure. Because it's one of those things where one part of it doesn't work on the day, and the whole thing can fall apart. Um, and actually, it's funny you mentioned the music there, which is David Turpin, the writer of the film, co-wrote the music with Stephen Shannon. So his hand is not just on the script writing, but it's also, you can hear it moment to moment in the score.
So Brian, clearly I'm going to have to ask him about the guilt question, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think you may have to. Yeah.
Okay, so
take on.
So we're going to have to wrap up here in a couple of minutes, sadly, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat. I hope we get to meet at the festival coming up in the very near future. But there's one line that I think is going to kind of haunt me, and no pun intended. And I think that, I guess, is the goal of a filmmaker like yourself. And it's a conversation, I think, between the twins, the brother and sister. And the line was, and it could be my paraphrase, but love can be worse than hate. And this is,
I think,
one of the best lines in the film. And I mean, I went all kinds of places with that, and the brokenness of it all. Rachel refers to Edward as being broken and maybe never going to be able to get beyond that. I mean, we've got so many metaphors. The house is in a state of dereliction. I mean, it just, there's all this stuff going on around this family, this dysfunctional family, and ultimately, though, it really, I mean, ultimately, love has to win in the end, doesn't it? Anyway.
Yeah, well, you'd like to think, wouldn't you? I mean, that's another fascinating question. Does love win at the end? I think it does, yeah, but it pays the price.
Yes.
But I think it does. I think love is the reason that the film concludes as it does, but there's several people pay a huge price for that love. But I do think it wins out despite the tragic conclusion to the film.
It's not a bad place to stop, eh? Love winning out. We're talking to Brian O'Malley here today on Face2Face about The Lodgers world premiere, I believe, coming up at the Toronto International Film Festival in the very near future. Brian, thanks a lot for your time. I've really enjoyed chatting about a film that, in truth, I wasn't sure that I was going to like, and I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it on a variety of levels. And I want to thank you again and congratulations. How are you feeling about coming to the festival?
Well, firstly, it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed chatting to you. It was
well, thank you.
Very interesting approach to discussing a film. So thank you very much. In terms of the festival, I'm really absolutely thrilled that the world premiere is at Toronto. I think that's a huge honor to show it for the first time at that festival. And I'm really, really excited for it. I've never been to Toronto. I've been to Montreal. So I'm really excited to see Toronto and to experience the film for the first time with an audience. But that's also genuinely a very nerve-wracking experience for the rest.
I bet it is.
I have no idea what people will think of the film, and that's quite nerve-wracking, to sit there, and I won't really know until the next day when some reviews come out what people think of it. But that's part of the process, isn't it?
It's part of the process, and well, listen, I actually truly think it was it's a marvelous piece of filmmaking, and I love the film, and I hope lots of people see it, and I hope lots of people reflect on it for days afterwards. I hope it does, in fact, truly haunt them, and I also hope too, Brian, you enjoy the festival. I hope I know, been working at it for a few years now, and I know that some people just can't get beyond the Q&As, if you know what I mean, and yes. It sounds like you got a whole lot of perspective there anyway. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. I hope you get to enjoy Toronto.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. Thank you very much.